All right, Sheol, Hades, Paradise, and Gehenna. Lots of misinterpretations on these words. Dr. Robert A. Morey does an excellent study on this, and here it is. In his book, Death and the Afterlife, he says, relative to Sheol, the Hebrew word Sheol is found 66 times in the Old Testament. While the Old Testament consistently refers to the body as going to the grave, it always refers to the soul or spirit of man as going to Sheol. Lexicographical material. Brown, Driver, and Briggs, a Hebrew and English lexicon of the Old Testament, they defined Sheol as the underworld, whither a man descends at death. They trace the origin of Sheol to either Sheol, which means the spirit world, to which mediums directed their questions to the departed, or Sheol, which refers to the hollow place in the earth where the souls of men went at death. Lange's Hebrew English Dictionary to the Old Testament defines Sheol as netherworld, realm of the dead, Hades. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, in Volume 4, defines Sheol as the unseen world, the state or abode of the dead, and is the equivalent of the Greek Hades. Kyle and Delitzsch state that Sheol denotes the place where departed souls are gathered after death. It is an infinitive form from Sheol, to demand, the demanding applied to the place which inexorably summons all men into its shade. The lexicographical evidence is so clear that the great Princeton scholar B.B. Warfield stated that with modern Hebrew scholars there is no hesitation to allow with all heartiness that Israel, from the beginning of its recorded history, cherished the most settled conviction of the persistence of the soul in life after death. The body is laid in the grave, and the soul departs to Sheol. George Eldon Ladd, in the New Bible Dictionary, comments, in the Old Testament, man does not cease to exist at death, but his soul descends to Sheol. Modern scholarship understands the word Sheol to refer to the place where the soul or spirit of man goes to death. None of the lexicographical literature defines Sheol as referring to the grave or to passing into non-existence. Comparative studies. In order to understand what a certain word meant in an ancient language, it is sometimes helpful to find any parallel words in the other languages of that time. Thus, comparative studies of Sheol have been done which demonstrate that Sheol's parallels in other languages meant the place where the soul of man goes at death. No research has found a place where Sheol's parallel means the grave or non-existence. For example, Ugaritic Ars and Akkadian Suda Alu clearly refer to the netherworld. The Babylonians, Assyrians, Egyptians, and Greek parallels to Sheol clearly meant the place of departed spirits. The Ethiopian Sheol cannot mean anything other than the netherworld, the place of conscious life after death. Historical context. What is important about comparative studies is that they place biblical words in their historical context. The word Sheol should thus be understood in terms of what it meant in the Hebrew language and by its parallel in the other languages of that time. Why? Well, when God wanted Israel to believe something which was unique and contrary to what the surrounding culture believed, and soul sleep would be unique and contrary, he always clearly condemned and forbade the pagan beliefs, and then stressed the uniqueness of the new concept. For example, in order to establish monotheism, God repeatedly and clearly condemned the pagan concept of polytheism and stressed monotheism. While God clearly condemned polytheism in the Old Testament, at no time did he ever condemn belief in a conscious afterlife. And in no time did God ever put forth the concept of annihilation or non-existence as the fate of man's soul at death, nor condemn the concept of a conscious afterlife. Also, when Israel had a unique and contrary belief, the pagan societies around Israel would use this belief as the grounds to persecute the Jews. Thus the Jews were persecuted for rejecting polytheism and believing in monotheism. Daniel's 3 friends who were thrown into a fire furnace are an excellent example of such persecution. Yet, where in recorded history did pagan religions or societies persecute the Jews because they denied a conscious afterlife? To think that the Jews could go against the universally held concept of a conscious afterlife, and that the pagans would not seize upon this as a pretense for persecution is absurd. Since the universality of belief in a conscious afterlife is irrefutable, and there is no evidence that Israel deviated from this belief, we must assume that the Old Testament taught a conscious afterlife in Sheol as the fate of man's soul or spirit. Sheol and the grave. King James Version translates Sheol as hell 31 times, grave 31 times, and pit three times. Because of this inconsistency of translation, objectors to a conscious afterlife have taught that Sheol means the grave. But Sheol cannot mean the grave. First, exegetically speaking, the initial occurrence of Sheol in the Old Testament cannot mean the grave. The word Sheol is first found in Genesis 37:35. After the brothers had sold Joseph into slavery, they informed their father that Joseph had been killed and devoured by a savage beast. As Jacob held the bloodied and tattered remains of Joseph's coats in his hands, he declared, "A wild beast has devoured him." Joseph had surely been torn to pieces. As a result of the shock of the death of Joseph, Jacob cried, "Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son." There are several things about this first occurrence of Sheol which should be pointed out. 1. Jacob assumed that his son was still alive and conscious after death, and that he would eventually reunite with his son after his own death. The German commentator Lange comments, "One thing is clear, Joseph's death was not a state of non-being. Jacob was going to be with his son. He was still his son. There was yet a tie between him and his son. He is still spoken of as a personality. He is still regarded as having a being somehow and somewhere." Whatever else Sheol may mean, in this passage it cannot mean Joseph's grave, for Jacob believed that Joseph had been devoured by an animal and had no grave. Since Joseph had no grave, it is impossible for Jacob to be referring to being buried in a common grave with his son. According to the context, Jacob is clearly speaking of reuniting with his favorite son in the underworld, here called Sheol. He even speaks of going down to reunite with his son, because it was assumed that Sheol was the place of departed spirits, probably a hollow place in the center of the earth. The second reason for not identifying Sheol as the grave is that when the biblical authors wanted to speak of the grave, they used the Hebrew word kavar. That they did not view kavar and Sheol as synonymous is clear from the way these words are used throughout the Old Testament. For example, Isaiah 14:19, the king is figuratively cast out of his grave in order to be thrown into Sheol, where the departed spirits can rebuke him. In this passage, Sheol and kavar are opposites, not synonyms. Isaiah 14:9-11. Sheol below is all astir to meet you, the oppressor Sennacherib, the new dead tyrant king of Babylon. At your coming, it rouses the spirits of the dead, Rephaim, to greet you. All those who were leaders in the world, it makes them rise from their thrones. A sarcastic figure of speech, for there are no thrones indicated as existing in Sheol. All these, those who were kings over the nation. Spirits of the dead, Rephaim. A word is defined in the theological wordbook of the Old Testament. An idea of Ugaritic origin, Ripi, which means the dead inhabitants of the netherworld, which indicates a conscious albeit spirit existence after death. And Sennacherib is clearly indicated in this passage as dead, yet still existing in a different sphere, the sphere of Sheol. Proverbs 2:18. For her adulterous house leads down to death, and her paths to the spirit of the dead. Rephaim. Isaiah 14:9-11. They, the dead ex-hunters of the world in Sheol, will all respond. They will say to you, you, Sennacherib, have also become weak. As we are, you are become like us. All your pomp has been brought down to Sheol. Along with the noise of your harps, maggots are spread out beneath you, and worms cover you, referring to the dead corpse of his physical body, which was buried in a common grave and not in the customary tomb for a king. Having been assassinated by his sons and purposely given a kingly burial in the tomb, the sphere, the physical site of his dead body in the common grave covered with worms and maggots is portrayed in this contrast to the conscious conversation with him, which is going to be Sheol, and with other dead kings, a different place from the grave. Well, here we go. Moore says, third, in the Septuagint, Sheol is never translated as Menima, which is the Greek word for grave. It is always translated as Hades, which meant the underworld. Kivar is never translated as Hades, just as Sheol is never translated as Menima. Fourth, Kivar and Sheol are never used in Hebrew poetic parallelism as equivalents. They are always contrasted and never equated. Kivar is the fate of the body, while Sheol is the fate of the soul. Psalm 16:8-11. I've set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my tongue rejoices. My body also will rest secure, because you will not abandon me to Sheol, nor will you let your Holy One see decay. David, who was holy, is set apart for salvation and to eternal life. Alan P. Ross, Bible Knowledge Commentary. Let's read what he has to say. David was assured that the Lord would preserve his life in the face of death. He rejoiced because God enabled his body to rest securely even when confronted with death. The reason he could rest is that God would not abandon him to the grave, nor let his body and the Holy One see decay. This verse refers to David, who describes himself as God's Holy One, that is, one of God's saints. He took comfort in the fact that God would not at that time allow his body to die and decay in the grave. He would, in other words, be resurrected at some time. In fact, God had caused him to know the path of life, so he anticipated experiencing further joy in God's presence. Death posed no threat to David because he enjoyed great blessing and fellowship with the Lord. God would not permit death in the grave to interrupt that marvelous fellowship, so Saul's sleep was obviously out of the question in David's mind. You have made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal presence at your right hand. Compare Philippians 1:23. The Apostle Paul states, I am torn between the two. To live is Christ, to live and die is gain. I desire to depart and be with Christ, who at that moment, and this is in heaven, which indicates that Paul would be conscious with the afterlife. Oops, let me fix that.